Now I'd like to introduce today's featured presenter, Pamela Hinds. Pamela Hinds is a professor of management science and engineering in the School of Engineering at Stanford University, the director of the Center for Work Technology and Organization, and faculty director of the School of Engineering's Global Engineering Programs for students. Pamela studies the effect of technology on groups. She's contributed extensive research on the dynamics of geographically distributed work teams, particularly those spanning national boundaries. She explores issues of culture, language, emotion, conflict, and the role of site visits in promoting trust and collaboration. Most recently, she has been exploring the relationship between national culture and work practices, especially innovation practices. Pamela has also been exploring the relationship between national culture and technology use, and is interested in the design of collaborative technologies for use across national boundaries. Now I'll turn it over to Pamela.
Okay, as Sherry said, I'm going to be talking a little bit today about us versus them, overcoming differences to inspire collaboration. Many of you are probably working in teams that are spanning a variety of different kinds of boundaries, working with people who are maybe in a different location, even in a different country, from a different discipline, in a different organization, and so forth. And all of those differences can really lead to positive outcomes, but can also be challenging for people, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So one premise, and this is something that was mentioned by an article by Forbes, diversity is a key driver for innovation, and that is something that is generally believed to be true. What we've seen over the last couple of decades is that more and more organizations are looking to diversity as a way to bring in different perspectives and drive higher levels of innovation. There was a survey that was done by Forbes of C-level executives around the globe, and they asked them, does a diverse, inclusive workforce, is it crucial to encouraging different perspectives and ideas that drive innovation? 48% of the people surveyed strongly agreed with that statement. 37% somewhat agreed. So a very large percentage of the respondents really do believe that having a diverse and inclusive workforce helps bring in these different perspectives and increase the innovation potential of an organization. So another quick poll. In your opinion, does working across boundaries actually increase innovation? We'll have about 10 seconds for you to complete the poll. If you don't think it really helps at all, you could answer 1 or A. If you think that it's really crucial for innovation, you can answer E or 5, very much. Okay, so the poll has ended, and we're going to take just a few seconds to pull up the results of that. Okay, here we go. And what we're seeing is, just like the executives that were polled around the globe, many people, seem to think that, it probably leads to higher levels of innovation, or even, we've got 127 respondents that said that it's very important. It very much leads to innovation. So let's look at what the research shows. It actually depends. Does working across boundaries increase innovation? Some of the research suggests that there are real benefits, and some of it suggests that, in fact, we're not seeing higher levels of innovation. There's some work done by Lee Fleming at Harvard, and he looked in particular at diversity in team members' disciplines or backgrounds or functional expertise, and then mapped that against the value of innovation that they were producing in these teams. And there are two really important things that you'll see if you look closely at this graph. One is that the average value of innovation actually goes down as you get more diversity on the teams. So that's a little bit surprising, given that we really think and hope that higher levels of diversity should actually lead to more innovation. But the other thing that's really interesting about this slide is that the only time you see breakthrough innovations, the only time that you see really high levels of innovation is when you have this diversity in the teams. And what this tells us, and actually a lot of research that's been done on a variety of different kinds of diversity, including ethnic diversity, gender diversity, diversity in national background, and so forth, all of that research shows that oftentimes you do see a decrease in innovation and a decrease in performance when you have a lot of diversity in teams, but it's also an opportunity for really high levels of innovation. But the challenge is managing those teams. It takes a little bit more effort and attention to manage teams with higher levels of diversity. And a couple of elements. So first of all, we've got a lot of different kinds of diversity on the left side of this slide. And what really has to happen, what has to be managed in order to get the diversity or get the innovation that a team is looking for, first is you have to actually get the information out. The benefits of diversity is you have these different perspectives. You have different kinds of information that people have access to. But sometimes it's a little bit challenging to get all that information out in a way that it can be used toward innovation and in the team. And then the second element is once you've got the information out, you see that people are seeing these from different perspectives. How do you then integrate those different perspectives? How do you bring that together so that you're developing something new as a result of it? So let's dive a little bit down into the first one, getting information out. To achieve their innovation potential, teams need to first be able to get the information on the table. If you don't share these perspectives, then what's the point of working across boundaries at all? A couple different things that have to happen here. One is it really helps if the team has a learning orientation. And that's something that can be influenced by the culture of the organization, influenced by the leader of the organization. People really need to want to learn from others. They want to believe that learning these different perspectives is actually going to help them to be more successful in achieving their goals. They also need to anticipate that there are going to be alternative viewpoints when they go into a meeting. It turns out that if people walk into a meeting knowing that they're going to hear very different viewpoints, they come with a different mindset and are better able to process those different viewpoints. So, letting people know that that's valued and that they should expect that. And it's also really important that people feel valued and safe. People will not share their different perspectives if they feel like their perspective is not going to be appreciated, heard, and so forth. And then finally, it just takes more time. When everybody shares the same perspective, you've got a lot of common ground. It's really easy to talk quickly through things. But when people have really different perspectives, often much more explanation is needed in order for people to understand those different viewpoints, and that just takes time. And then once you've got the information out, the next hurdle is integrating this diverse information. People need to understand the relevance of what it is they've heard, and if people are coming from really different perspectives, it can be challenging to see how what somebody else is offering fits the way that you're thinking about the problem that you're working on. And sometimes it can just be hard to relate to and make sense of what somebody else is saying. A couple things that are really helpful in that. One is, again, it takes time. There needs to be more conversation, more discussion about these different perspectives in order to see the relevance, in order to figure out where there is common ground in the different viewpoints that are being brought together. And that helps to overcome what's called a representational gap, which is that when people particularly are coming from different disciplinary perspectives, they often have different ways that they have been trained to represent a problem. And again, if you can take the time for people to really articulate how they're representing the problem, how they're prioritizing different elements of it, then that can help people to find opportunities for common ground. So what we're going to focus on today is the us versus them dynamic that interferes with all of these processes. So that's one of the things that as leaders you can work on addressing in your teams. And that's effective whether you're cross-organizational, cross-functional, cross-geography, cross-cultural, and so forth. It turns out that the us versus them dynamic that you see in these teams is one of the most pervasive problems that we see in cross-boundary teams. It's one of these things that is just, it's so human. We have this natural tendency to subgroup into different groups that are similar to ourselves. And this is something that just naturally happens in these teams. And I'll talk a little bit today about why that happens and what we can do about it. But first, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, and then I'll just wait a few seconds. You might want to just write down a couple of your answers. So each of these, I'd like you to answer why you think this might have happened. So the first one is a colleague that you're working with in Amsterdam regularly gets up and leaves your teleconferences early at 4:50 p.m. their time instead of 5 o'clock p.m. So just make a couple of notes about why they might be doing this. All right, and then the next one, a coworker from marketing gives you misleading information. Why might that have happened? Again, just take a few seconds to jot down a couple notes. All right, and the third one is a colleague from another company that you're working with sends you an analysis that's badly flawed. Why might that have happened? Okay, so for each of these, there are many possible responses. For the colleague in Amsterdam, you might have said that they had a train to catch and it only leaves hourly and they need to get home to their family. You might have said that they're lazy, that they're uncommitted. These are all answers that I've gotten before to this question. For the second one, you might say that the person is incompetent, so they gave you misleading information, or they've got another agenda that they're working. You might have also said that they just have a different way of explaining things because they're from a different field. For the third one, you might have said that the person misunderstood the request or they didn't have the information that they needed. So these are all what we call attributions. They're ways of explaining things when things go wrong. And we are making attributions all day, every day. We're making judgments about why it is that something happened the way that it did. So there's a whole theory in psychology around attribution theory. And what attribution theory suggests is that there are two different types of attributions that we can make. We can make what are called dispositional attributions, and those are attributions that are about the person. So if you found yourself writing things like, they're lazy, uncommitted, incompetent, anything of that sort, those would be dispositional or personal attributions about why something went wrong. But then there's also situational attributions, and situational attributions are attributing what it is that went wrong to characteristics of the situation. So if you wrote things like, they need to catch the train, or they didn't have the information that they should have been given, and so forth, those are more situational attributions. And as you can imagine, the situational attributions tend to be a little bit more generous. The thing is that we tend to lean toward making more dispositional attributions in general. And the reason that we make more dispositional attributions or personal attributions is because we don't have as much information about why people are doing what they're doing. We have a lot of information about why we're doing what we're doing, but not so much with other people. And then if they are in a different location or in a different country, if they're in a different culture, in a different firm, we have even less information to help us explain why it is they're doing what they're doing. So there's a natural tendency in these cross-boundary teams to actually make more of these kind of harsh, personal kinds of attributions. And that really fuels this us versus them dynamic. There's an in-group bias as well, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. So what can you do as leaders when you see this us versus them dynamic? And I have to say, it is almost inevitable. You probably will see it. But you can also do things to reduce the likelihood of it showing up. So what are those? There are three things I'm going to talk about. One is shared identity, one is trust, and then the third is psychological safety. And these are all really intertwined. They're all mutually supportive of one another. So there's not one that's more important than the other. You could actually start at any one of these three, and that would help to erode some of the us versus them dynamics that you are seeing or that could happen in your team. So we'll start with shared identity. This is just some research that I did a while back with Mark Mortensen, who's at INSEAD in France. We were looking at globally distributed teams, and one of the things that we found was that having a shared identity significantly reduced the amount of conflict that occurred on these teams. And in particular, something called affective conflict, and that's where it really gets personal. So, having a shared identity really helps to reduce those negative attributions about the person in particular. And there's a ton of research in social psychology that looks at the importance of shared identity and having a vision. This is something that you can do in your teams as leaders. If people have a shared vision, they believe that they are working toward a common goal, that they are all in it together, that they are interdependent and have to rely on one another in order to be successful at achieving their goals, then you see a shared identity develop very rapidly, quite strongly, and the us versus them dynamics can virtually disappear if people are really focused on a strong shared vision. Now, the trick is that you can start this, at the beginning of a project. People can be really bought in. Everybody's really aligned with the vision and see how others fit in and why they need to work together. But when you're working across boundaries, it erodes more rapidly. If you are not co-located, people begin to make sense of the vision in different ways. If you are from different disciplines, you may start to prioritize one element over the other. So it's something that has to be continuously revisited and reinforced in order to ensure that that is still in place on an ongoing basis. So now we're going to talk a little bit about trust. And again, these are intertwined. So it turns out that if you've got a stronger shared identity, what comes with that is more trust. And if you've got more trust, it's easier to build a shared identity. So with trust, I'd like you to bring to mind somebody that you really trust. So just for a second, think of somebody. And then, again, just jot down, a couple of characteristics that lead you to trust this person. I'll give you a few seconds to write those down. Okay, so you might have written a whole host of things like, they care about you, they always do what they say, they know what they're doing. I'm sure there's a whole variety of things that you wrote down. What I'm going to show you now is definition of trust and then what some of the different elements are that have been found to compose trust and trustworthiness. So trust is assured reliance on the character, ability, or truth of someone or something, somebody in which you place confidence. And a more research-oriented definition, the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another person based on the expectation that that other person will perform a particular action that's important to you, the truster, irrespective of your ability to monitor or control that person. So there are a couple things I want to pull out of that definition. One is trust is really about being vulnerable. So it's only really trust if you've ended up in a situation where you actually depend upon that person and you trust them to actually do what it is you need done and they've said they would do. And importantly, it's irrespective of the ability to monitor or control the person. You know, some people say that, you know, you trust but control. The truth is they're different things, and oftentimes when you are especially geographically distributed, it's really difficult to monitor or control. So trust becomes even more important in these situations. And that's also true when you're crossing other kinds of boundaries. You know, when you're working across firm, it's true when you're working across disciplines where you actually don't have enough knowledge of that discipline to evaluate whether or not what they're doing is appropriate or correct. Then you really are vulnerable to their actions, and trust is required. Okay, so there are three elements of trust that have been identified in research. One is benevolence. So benevolence is really about whether or not the person is caring and concerned about you. Benevolence is, you know, at the extreme is, you know, they will do something for you even if they have to make a sacrifice for themselves. So, you know, if you said that, you know, I trust this person because they care about me, I know they'll do the right thing, then that's really benevolence. The next one is ability, and this is something that people often don't think about, but particularly in a work context, we have to believe that people can actually do what it is they need to do in order to trust them. They have to have the technical skills. They have to have, you know, the marketing savvy in order for us to trust that they're going to be able to fulfill their obligations to us. And then there's integrity, and integrity is really about reliability, predictability, honor. Do they have a code by which they are operating that you can count on? Doesn't necessarily need to be the same code as yours, but you can count on it. You know what it is to expect of them. And the three of these compose trust and trustworthiness. A couple of things that are sort of interesting to know is that different people value the different elements differently. So you may be somebody where your whole list was all about benevolence, but somebody else might really think it's all about ability, and you know they really want to work with people that are the most capable, and they don't worry too much about the others. So it's not a bad conversation to have to understand, you know, what people are really valuing, and to use that as a lens to evaluate whether or not you know, you can assess them as trustworthy. Okay, so if we're talking about cross-boundary teams, this is our next poll, is there generally less trust on cross-boundary teams or more trust? So we'll take about 10 seconds for you to answer this poll. Okay, and this can be any kind of cross-boundary team. All right, the poll has ended, and we're going to wait just a couple of seconds while we get the results of the poll to see whether or not people think there's going to be more or less or no difference on these teams. All right, well, this is interesting. Okay, so most people, 231 of the respondents, thought that there would be less trust on these cross-boundary teams. A handful thought it would be about the same, and a few people thought you actually could end up with more trust on these teams. So we thought that there would be less trust on these teams and set out to do a research study to see the extent to which that was true. And what we found was in fact, it was about the same. So these in particular were geographically co-located versus distributed teams, and they were also, they were construction engineering teams. So we had some architects, some people in construction, and a variety of other disciplines in there. So they were geographically distributed and also from different disciplines. But as you can see, we looked at month 1 when they formed these teams and month 3, and it didn't really seem to matter very much. So that kind of surprised us, and we dug a little deeper into the data to see what was going on. And what we saw was that on the co-located teams, it was much more volatile. So we ended up with dramatic increases in trust, but also dramatic decreases in trust. And we think that had a lot to do with the fact that when you're co-located, you can actually see people's behaviors more. You've got more information about whether or not they are caring toward other people, whether or not they are capable, whether or not they do have integrity. So, we got increases and decreases as people adjusted their levels of trust. In the distributed teams, there was a lot less adjustment. People started with a certain level of trust at the beginning, and that was maintained throughout. And looking at this a little bit more closely, what we saw was in co-located teams, people paid attention to the behavior, whether or not people were following through, their team members were following through, and that affected whether or not they were trustworthy, and then that affected their trust later in the process. But in the distributed teams, it started with perceived trustworthiness. So very quickly, people, team members evaluated whether or not somebody was trustworthy. Then when they saw their behaviors, they looked at those behaviors through that lens of being trustworthy or not, and then the attributions were aligned with whether or not they thought they were trustworthy, and then that affected trust later in the game. So basically what this shows is that establishing trust really early in these cross-boundary teams is crucial, because once it gets established, the updating doesn't happen as dynamically as it does on teams where there's a lot more similarity, and in particular when people are co-located and have more information about what people are doing. All right, so now we'll talk a little bit about psychological safety. And psychological safety is pretty closely related to trust. When you have more trust, people feel more safe psychologically. And if you've got more psychological safety, people are more trusting. And then the same thing with shared identity. So psychological safety is defined as a shared belief that's held by a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. This was an idea that was developed by Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School about 20 years ago. There's been a ton of research on psychological safety now, establishing it as an important predictor of team success and particularly team innovation in many places around the globe. The basic idea here is that people need to feel safe sharing unpopular opinions, sharing knowledge, pointing out errors, talking about mistakes that they've made. It's basically an environment where people feel like they are supported by one another, and there's not, competition and undermining going on by members of the team. So this is really crucial for innovation in general, and particularly when you have cross-boundary teams. Psychological safety has been shown to have significant impacts on team performance, on team problem solving, and particularly on learning and innovation in teams. And the interesting thing about psychological safety is that it is significantly affected by leader behavior. That is one of the #1 predictors of whether or not you'll have psychological safety, is whether or not the leader sort of sets the tone for people to feel comfortable. And again, this has been done around the globe. For example, when leaders are open, accessible, available to the people that they're working with, when they model psychological safe behaviors. They talk about mistakes that they've made. They don't punish or degrade people who have failed, but really use that as a learning opportunity. All of that behavior by leaders leads to higher levels of psychological safety. And then one additional practice I wanted to share with you is team reflection. So this can really help increase psychological safety as well as trust, where teams actually take 15 minutes on occasion, maybe once a month or so, to just reflect on how things are going. Are they happy with their performance? Are they happy with the process? Are they happy with the way that they're working together? How might they improve their ability to work together? What are the strategies that they might use in order to get better performance and feel better about the process? The interesting thing is it's sort of like exercising regularly. Even though you know it's good for you, it doesn't always happen spontaneously. People are really busy. People are focused on the work that they need to get done. So it is really important that a context be set for this to happen, where the leader, for example, says, okay, we are going to do this, every month or at some specified interval, and time is actually made for it. Reflective teams are more effective, but you've got to make the commitment to that. All right, so just to sort of summarize what we've talked about here, shared identity is a really powerful condition for teams, and that can be established with a common vision, making sure that people understand their interdependencies, what it is they're working on together, and continue to reinforce that over time. With trust, be vigilant against harsh attributions. One of the ways to do this is to always seek clarifying information. If you find yourself making harsh attributions about particularly people, in these cross-boundary situations, or you see team members making harsh attributions, personal kinds of attributions. It's always good to ask the question, well, what else might be going on here? What other information could I get to help me to understand what really is the reason behind this behavior? And that can really diffuse the harsh attributions and increase trust. And then with regard to psychological safety, a leader can be a role model by discussing mistakes, being respectful of others, not punishing failure, expressing care and concern about employees, and so forth. And then team reflection can help with all of this. All right, so to wrap up on cross-boundary teaming, we've talked about some of the core issues that occur when people are working across these boundaries and these us versus them dynamics emerge. And hopefully I've convinced you that you can sustain higher levels of performance and innovation by fostering shared identity, psychological safety, and higher levels of trust. So thank you very much. We've got some time for questions. I'm going to turn it over to Sherry, who is going to facilitate that process.
So let's see. So from our participant, here's one. What's your advice for teams, Pamela, that have very different business styles, and some of which may be cultural? Here's the example. Specifically, we work with a team in Frankfurt that's very cautious, methodical, and adverse to failure. Our scientists and engineers in San Jose are more aggressive with innovation and willing to accept small failures to advance more quickly to a final successful design. How do they compromise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It is something that I talk about much more extensively in the course, the cultural differences, and in particular, differences in practices. One of the things that I've found in my research where we've looked at innovation and innovation practices in different parts of the world is that there are different approaches to innovation. And in fact, what we found is that some of the things like rapid iteration that is so touted in the Silicon Valley in the U.S. culture actually can have negative effects in some other cultural contexts. So I think it's really important to know that what works for innovation in one culture may not work in another culture. And I think the first thing to do is to figure out what the best practices are for innovation in the culture in which you're working, because it may not be the same. And then figure out how to, I don't know if you want to compromise or if you want to allow multiple practices to coexist in order to get the most out of different people, or maybe try out different practices and see what that generates. But I do think that it's really important to start with the practice and understand how those differ in different cultures, and not only national cultures, but also in functional cultures. Different professions have very, very different practices, and really understanding those can help to figure out how to work together and achieve high levels of innovation in a united way.
Thank you. We have another participant asking, do you think trust needs evidence to be built?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There is some research that talks about something called swift trust. So swift trust does not need evidence to be built. Swift trust happens because you've got information that gives you confidence that this person should be trusted. So, for example, it's somebody that's been recommended to you by somebody else that you trust a lot, or they've gone to a top-tier university and gotten good grades. Well, then you might automatically think that they're going to be a really competent, capable person. So there's a lot of information that we look to in our environment to figure out whether or not somebody should be trusted, and we can look at that evidence to build this swift trust, or maybe somebody's licensed in a particular field. So there is this swift trust. It doesn't last forever, though. As you are working with somebody, you are always getting evidence about trust and trustworthiness. So yes, certainly over time, you do need evidence in order to, I wouldn't say determine your level of trust, but adjust your level of initial trust that was formed. The challenge is that the way that we process that information can sometimes be biased because we don't have full information, and these attributions are at play. So we may see evidence of something, for example, somebody not delivering a report on time, and we may then have our trust lowered as a result of that, when in fact there might have been something else going on. So really important that the trust and the attributions are really intertwined. And one of the things that I really encourage on these cross-boundary teams is to give people the benefit of the doubt, to trust them first, and then figure out what it is that might have been going on.
Great. Here's one. Building trust with an overseas team in Europe has become very challenging. Flow of information is one way. I don't get any information back from them. What are the options this participant might have?
Yeah, that's another really good question. Tough situation. And it's not uncommon to have these situations where there's not enough communication between teams or sub-teams that are located in different parts of the globe. I guess a couple of things I'd try. One is that's more likely to happen if there isn't a strong sense of interdependence. If they really rely on you for their success, then they should be in contact with you more frequently. So that, there's something going on there potentially. So that might mean that, there's not the kind of shared identity, there's not the kind of shared vision that needs to be present in order for that team to function as effectively as they need to. The other thing that can happen is, people just get really busy. I've seen a lot of teams where there's just not very much communication from one location, and it's because there's just a lot going on that we don't even know about at that location. So it's another case where I think, it's always good to, if you can, send a text message or pick up the phone, during their daytime hours, and just check in with somebody that you feel like you've got a good rapport with, and say, hey, just checking in, what's going on over there. Wanted to see, if there's anything that we should know about, what's happening in your world there right now, in order to get a better sense of why they might not be responding as quickly as you'd hope.
Sounds like good advice. Another participant asking you to clarify what that team reflection could look like.
Great. So team reflection, oftentimes it's just a really informal process. So getting team members in the room and, asking the question, how are things going? Or getting in the room either virtually or in person. It's good to have it happen in person, but oftentimes that is not possible. Better to have it on video than just audio when you're doing these kinds of reflections, because those additional cues where you can see people's facial expressions and gestures can be really useful in a reflective kind of activity. And, you might want to use a process where people are able to, write down on Post-it notes or something, what they think is going well and where they think the opportunities are for improvement in either their performance or in their group process. And then, talk through those. Ideally, have an open conversation where people can, articulate what it is that is working for them and is not working for them, and then identify some strategies. What could we do in the next week in order to help us improve on this particular element? And again, just having a really, open, not rushed kind of context. And if it's done regularly, then people get accustomed to doing it.
Great. You talked a lot about building trust early. We're getting several questions on how do you back up from a team that's become dysfunctional. So how do you rebuild trust when it's been shattered and respect is non-existent?
Yeah, that is really challenging. I think my inclination would be to go with one of the other two boxes on the chart. Psychological safety has also probably been undermined on that team, and people may have lost sight of why they need one another and why they want to build trust and work together. So I would probably start with the shared identity piece and really helping people to see why this whole group is in the room, why they depend upon each other, and why it's really important to rebuild the bonds that they have. And I think it's important to name it too, to say, look, trust has broken down, a whole variety of reasons for why that might have happened. Let's use some techniques to, rebuild that and create a higher level of psychological safety. And again, both with this question and the previous question, the leader modeling is really important in this. So, the leader, saying, we've, had some breakdowns in trust. I hold some of the responsibility for this. I want to rebuild it. And with psychological safety, the leader showing some vulnerability, talking about mistakes and so forth, all of that openness. And it's challenging because when trust isn't there, the openness is hard and it can be misinterpreted. So you kind of have to take baby steps in order to help rebuild. And sometimes it does help to get a facilitator in. If trust is really damaged, it can help to get a mediator in that can help facilitate those conversations.
Here's a question that's addressing language issues. I'm an American, but my team is located in Brazil. While my Portuguese is usually adequate, there are times when I sense frustration on the part of my colleagues when I ask them to repeat things. How would you advise team members to be more effective communicators when the primary language used for business isn't their first language?
Yeah, that's a great question. Language is really challenging, and that's another segment that's covered in the course, language challenges, both professional languages and national languages. A couple things on that. One is that we need to recognize, and this isn't always recognized, that fluent does not mean fluent. When somebody is doing business in a language that is their non-native language, it is more challenging for them. They tend to be, it takes more cognitive effort. There might be vocabulary that they don't have access to. They may have an accent, may mispronounce things, and so forth. And oftentimes, native speakers, and this is particularly true of native English speakers, in part because of the way our cultures operate as well, we tend not to be as patient as we could be with that. So I think part of it is just building an appreciation on both sides for what it means and what the experience is of somebody who is having to operate in a non-native language, and what the experience is of somebody who is a native language speaker of the chosen language, the lingua franca, and having to sort of slow down their processes in order to work effectively in those teams. So in particular with your question, I think part of it is, just letting the team members that you're working with in Brazil know that that you are trying really hard, that you are attempting to speak Portuguese, but you don't have the same level of fluency, and that you really appreciate their patience in allowing you to occasionally not be as articulate as you would be in your native language. So it's one, but a lot of this is about perspective taking and understanding what people are experiencing.
So you were talking about harsh attribution. One of our participants is saying they see issues of harsh attribution happening, in this case, between male and female colleagues, which is escalating very quickly. How do they fix that?
Interesting. Harsh attributions between male and female colleagues. So I'm just kind of thinking through this. It sounds like it's an us versus them problem. We tend to see more harsh attributions when people see people as others. So it's a little hard to know without knowing more about the situation. But I think the core of the problem is that there's subgrouping going on. And for some reason, there is, the women are feeling ostracized by the men, or vice versa, and that needs to be resolved in order for these harsh attributions to diminish. My guess is that for some reason there isn't a sense of psychological safety for either the men or the women in this group, so that might be something to talk about. It might be worth having a conversation about what it is that's going on. And there also, potentially there could be competition that's going on. There might be a feeling of powerlessness in one group or the other that is leading to this. So I would try to dig a little bit deeper to investigate what the source is of this division, this subgrouping that's happening between the genders. And sometimes it can actually be something in the content of what you're working on. For example, if the women are responsible for a particular part of the project and the men are responsible for another particular part of the project, that can set up this dynamic as well.
Great. And asking here for recommendations on virtual team building exercises. What are some of the kinds of things teams can do to build that trust?
Yeah. So a lot of people, what they want to do is get everybody together in a neutral location for a couple of days of team building. I am actually not a fan of that at all. If you've got a lot of money and a lot of time, great, fun thing to do. But I don't think the half-life is relatively short of those activities. And the reason the half-life is short is because you're not getting at the core issues that get in the way. And the core issues are really the work and how people do the work. And when you're off team building, that's not what people are doing. You're getting to know one another, you're understanding personalities and so forth. So it's good. I'm not saying it's not a good thing, but I'm a real advocate for having people travel to the location of the other site or sites they're working with, and not just the manager, but the team members travel so that they can see the context in which one another are working. With the example from Frankfurt, where their innovation approach is very different. It's really good to go and actually sit side by side and see how people are working and who talks to them and what their office space looks like and what they do for lunch and the cultural context in which they're embedded. That has a much more profound effect on collaboration going forward than team building kinds of activities.
Great. Thank you so much, Pamela. We really want to thank you for your time today. We hope you enjoyed the hour, and we encourage you to check out all of our offerings at scpd.stanford.edu. And again, don't forget that you'll be receiving a recording of this webinar to share with your friends and colleagues. Have a great day.